Hey, it's the Latino Newsletter podcast, a show about us all the time. I'm your host, Julio Ricardo Varela. A special thanks to the generous support from the Latino Community Foundation for sponsoring season 1 of this podcast. And you can learn more about the Latino Community Foundation at latinocf.org. Okay, we are at episode 5. And the response to the podcast has been pretty incredible so far. Seriously, it's been fun. Thank you all for the early love. We see you out there. Believe me, we get the comments and the email messages and the kudos and the texts. And really appreciate it. We're scrappy. This is a scrappy podcast. Kind of like the New York Knicks. Listen, I know I'm laughing a little bit. I know I'm being humorous because I want to start this show with a lot of positive energy. But now this is the part where we make the pivot, the detour. We're going to be shifting to a topic that I have been personally following and covering as a journalist for years, and what I have called countless times a third rail issue in Latin America. We're talking about Venezuela. I've written a lot about Venezuela over the years. I've had several shows about Venezuela. It's one of those topics that we have covered a lot in the past for Latino Rebels. You know, you can't make everyone happy with this issue. You really can't. And there have been times where people go online and be like, you're a fascist, right-wing Latin American autocrat, or you're a radical leftist working for the Chavez regime. I've had all that sent my way. And I'm just going to be really honest here. As a journalist, it's not my job to make everyone happy. It's my job to inform. So I am always going to be here to have the uncomfortable and honest conversations about Venezuela. I've talked to people, tons of people, both in the United States and in Venezuela about this. It's sad. The situation in Venezuela is really difficult. And no, I don't work for the CIA and I don't work for the Maduro government. I'm a Latin Americanist. That's what I studied in college. Look it up. And Venezuela has fascinated me for so many years. So where are we right now, 1 month after the presidential elections in Venezuela, which, to say the least, have been really controversial, have led to violence, have led to a lot of I don't know, especially in the online space, a lot of vitriol. You don't know what's the right information, what's the wrong information. And many people think what's happening in Venezuela is undemocratic, but to others, it's just an example of classic American imperialism. But you can't deny this, okay? This is why Venezuela matters in the United States, because it's now part of the American political discourse. Because, and I'm going to cite Pew Research, okay, because I'm going to bring in some facts. Venezuelans are the 12th largest population of Hispanic origin living in the United States. They account for about 1% of the U.S. Hispanic population in 2021. But, okay, Pew doesn't say but. This is the Julio but. Now I'm back to quoting Pew. From 2000 to 2021, the Venezuelan origin population increased 592% in the United States. 592%, growing from 95,000 to 640,000. And it continues to grow. And as of April, 8 million Venezuelans have left the country over the years. Okay, so you can say what you want. We can talk, this is not about socialism or what's working or what's not. This is about people, okay? And sometimes we tend to forget when we talk about Latin America and this left-right dichotomy that we tend to ignore people. So, I'm actually bringing a fabulous guest and a friend and also a former client to the show. Total disclosure, I did some consulting work for this fabulous guest earlier this year. So I'm going to now read the bio of this fabulous guest. And here we go. Liz Rebecca Alarcón is a media entrepreneur and a political analyst with expertise in Latin America and U.S. Latinos. She's the founder and CEO of Pulso, which is a nonprofit media outlet reaching more than 1 million Latinos with history, culture, and commentary, helping Latinos understand themselves, each other, and the world around them. Liz Rebecca's writing and commentary has been featured in the New York Times, The Atlantic, MSNBC, Time Magazine, and the Miami Herald, among other outlets. You can also listen to her weekly in English on Pulso's podcast In Confianza, I-N, not N, In Confianza, get it? Or in Spanish every Friday on her radio show on Miami's 11:40 a.m. Like, she's on AM radio in Miami. Liz Rebecca.
Julio, Ricardo.
Welcome to the Latino Newsletter podcast. You know, we have a joke about this, right? Remember when we were working together earlier this year and you kept on calling me Julio Ricardo, and I'm like, nobody calls me that. People call me Julio or Julito. But I'm into it, Liz Rebecca. I'm so into it. So thank you.
If you have two names, es para usarlos. A mí me llaman Liz Rebecca, por favor y gracias. That's why we have our full nombres de novelas to distinguish ourselves in this crowded Latino space. I'm so excited to be here. Thank you for having me.
So I know that was the humorous part of the show, but we really do have to talk about Venezuela and all that has been happening over the last month. And to frame this, Liz Rebecca, because you've been so close following this, I see all the work that you're doing, the appearances you're making, what you're posting. Can you try to summarize for anyone who has no clue what has gone on in the last month to set the context? Take it away. The mic is yours.
We are precisely at the month mark today, August 28th, from a month ago when Maria Corina Machado and Edmundo González Urrutia won in a landslide election against the Maduro government that Sunday, July 28th. And since then, what has happened is what many of us expected, that one, the Maduro regime would not recognize their defeat on July 28th. Two, that the opposition would have a plan to defend this win, given that for the first time really in over a decade, the opposition finally does actually have a majority. The opposition is united in their rejection of this continuous government that has not only caused political unrest, but economic unrest, and that is widely corrupt and is guilty of the most massive exodus of Venezuelans out of the country in history, and one of the worst migration crises in the Western Hemisphere. More than 8 million Venezuelans have left the country since the Chavez, but really since the Maduro regime has stayed in power over the last decade. And so in the last month, the opposition has uploaded vote tallies precinct by precinct to a public website where not only anyone who wants to can verify, but each voter can see how they voted to prove that they have, again, more than double the votes in their favor, and that it's time for the Maduro regime to listen to the people and to go. And so because we know that authoritarians do not just leave like that democratically, what has happened over the last month, including today, where there are another slew of protests across Venezuela and across many cities around the world, is to defend that vote, to defend that result, and to go hasta el final, as Maria Corina and Edmundo often say, to really make sure that there is an exit and that the Maduro government listens to the will of the people.
We know this is controversial. I'm not going to get into the back and forth here. If you could tell someone factually, like, why it was a landslide, because I think that's a big question. And also things like the Carter Center, which, you know, previous to this election, the Carter Center was always used as sort of the the arbiter of, real elections in Venezuela, and to see the Carter Center speak out against this was pretty surprising to me. But can you just speak a little bit more from the voting aspect of it?
Absolutely. And it's heated and it's personal because we're not just talking about, one candidate versus the other and whose opinion here on the results should we be taking into account. We're talking about years and years of, you're absolutely right, the Carter Center and others verifying Venezuelan elections as legitimate. And there's one thing when we talk about the technicalities of the day of, and there's another thing when we talk about the actual process of upholding and having free and fair elections, which we know that is not the case in Venezuela. And so in the past, while the vote tally on the day of has been quite close, while no one can deny, especially before the last decade, that that Chavismo and Madurismo has won elections, the conditions to get us there have year after year been less and less free. So, for example, Maria Corina Machado, the leader of the opposition, which you all have heard everywhere, was the candidate. She was then denied the ability to actually run in the elections. She then picked a candidate to replace her, Corina, very astutely named. Then the Maduro regime also made her not able to participate in the elections. And so third candidate is a charm, right? Then the opposition, united as ever again, which is also important here, put Edmundo González Urrutia on the ballot. So already there, you're seeing the irregularities to limit the ability of the opposition to run in free and fair elections. Then you had an extremely complicated ballot that made it very, 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 very difficult for you to even see where the candidates were and who to vote for. So then that requires a whole civic education campaign to actually help people understand the ballots. Then let's talk about the media. You have an extremely unfair and repressed media ecosystem in Venezuela, where there are very few independent media outlets that make it difficult for people to understand the vote. So that's the context before getting there. But then when you get to the actual elections, which is what we're now talking about, you do have a pretty robust and accurate electoral process on the day of, where international observers were there, including the Carter Center, where the law allowed for there to be thousands of testigos de mesa, as we say in Spanish, to actually be there precinct by precinct and receive an actual printed copy of the vote tallies on that day. So shame on the Maduro regime for actually still permitting that part of the law to be enacted, because those are the actual measures of proof that the opposition is now utilizing, las famosas actas, to show that they won by 71% of the vote in every single precinct across the country, even where Madurismo had a stronghold. And so that is what I mean when we say that we won by a landslide. That is why the Carter Center and others can't deny that that is the truth of the results of the election. And meanwhile, Madurismo is saying that they won by 51% of the vote. It's a month later and they've shown no proof.
How do you tie this to U.S. politics? How do you tie this to what the U.S. is saying? How do you tie this with what the Venezuelan American community is saying?
Well, I think important to note is that in large part, first on the foreign policy front, these elections are possible because of the Biden administration negotiations in Barbados that put the conditions of elections with a time frame that was met in order for the U.S. to lift some of those economic sanctions that the Maduro regime had been complaining about for quite some time. So I think that first, there has been direct involvement in actually even leading us to this point of elections. I think the second is that every election cycle, we see the right side of the aisle historically pandering much more to the Venezuelan vote, using this issue of socialism and, their version of freedom to rally not just Venezuelans, but Cuban Americans and Nicaraguan Americans, especially the South Florida Latino vote, around rejecting that ideology and choosing a different path here. So that, of course, is part of the mix when we think of the U.S. context. I think the third is also what we've been hearing about on the border. There were a whole host of issues over really 2024 with Venezuelan migrants and busing them to different parts of the country. If you all remember the debacle at Martha's Vineyard, we've had instances.
That's my state. Yes, I do remember it.
Yeah, exactly. And so that happened. We've had instances of, unfortunately, very viral moments of crime where Venezuelan migrants have been the protagonists. And we've had hundreds of thousands of Venezuelans reach the border trying to come here because of the unrest in the country. And so that adds a third element to this conversation, while at the same time we have the Biden administration continuing policies like TPS for Venezuelans, which anytime I often share that. My cousin is a proud recipient of that and is here working legally and studying thanks to that program, all happening at the same time. And so the Venezuela issue, although you named, Julio, Ricardo, that we're a growing population, the reality is we're not quite a huge voting bloc yet, but it is such a emotionally triggering political reality that reverberates across other Latino nationalities or countries of origin, that it's always in the mix whenever an election cycle comes.
So this is the question. You mentioned the right, and I've always meant to ask, like, because you side on the progressive side of politics. I mean, I think you're my progressive Venezuelan friend, right, Luis Rebecca?
I love that title. I happily carry that mantle. Yes,
you do. You proudly do, and very unapologetic about it. What's the best case from a progressive point of view, from an American progressive political point of view, from a Latino progressive political point of view, from a Venezuelan progressive political point of view? What's the best case for supporting the opposition?
I am the first one to critique the progressive and even more center left side of the political spectrum as being scared to have a strong POV on foreign policy that takes us away from this Cold War era and that centers everything on US imperialism and blames the US for everything. That's a pretty outdated model. And I'm not apologizing for all the harms and horrors that the US has done historically, but that is just simply a two-dimensional, outdated way to think of the world order now, right?
I think you can have an and. That's what I think that's what you're saying. It's like you can talk about American imperialism and also talk about the state of leftist autocratic governments in Latin America. I mean, I find those things to be two truths.
Exactly. It's a yes and that's actually one of my favorite phrases. You can't yes and you can't deny the authoritarian, corrupt realities of the Maduro government. There's political prisoners, like I said, lack of free press, there's economic turmoil, and no exodus of people en masse to the degree that we have seen over the last several decades is that it can be blamed by US sanctions, right? Which is a lot of what the left and progressive leaders will say. This unrest was existing before measures to try to pressure the Maduro regime to change course by the US and other governments were even enacted. And you can argue sanctions all you want. I personally agree with blanket economic sanctions not being the answer. If not, we would see a free Cuba today, and we don't have a free Cuba. So I think that targeted sanctions against specific leaders within a corrupt regime are the way to go when it comes to that. But look at who's leaving, Julio, Ricardo. O sea, people are walking across borders to find a better life. You're not going to tell me that's the right-wing elite of Venezuela. When we saw las marchas over the last month, it was people from Petare. That was the strongest Maduro and Chavista stronghold in the entire country. And those are the young people of color, brown and black, not wealthy folks, right? Coming out and saying, we are done and we are tired and we don't have economic opportunity and we are being suppressed. And so on the left, I would say, if you're not listening to Black Venezuelans and brown Venezuelans and poor Venezuelans and the actual grassroots who are telling you that this regime has to go, then you're selectively picking how you support liberation internationally, and you're just an ideologue, right? And that's not the progressive values that I live by, right? And so I often will point to those numbers that don't lie. I will point to the perpetuating themselves in power, right? And the narco government that is no secret that Venezuela is governed under now, with this conspiracy, or not conspiracy, camaraderie between the military and the executive branch, and the takeover of all the other branches of government. Listen to the people who are living under these conditions, and then tell me if you're on the right side of history by supporting Maduro or not.
Okay. What else is missing in this debate that if you could tell American mainstream media, yo, what's up? Like, this is the way you should focus on this.
I think what's missing is really celebrating how much trial and error, work, sweat, tears, organizing, and learning from our mistakes it has taken to get here. I would love to see the plight of Venezuelans be compared to what just happened in Bangladesh, where we had hundreds of thousands of people on the street day after day, receiving government crackdowns and having civilians be killed, and the regime cracking down, and still a prime minister heeding pressure and having to resign. I would love for the plight of Venezuelans to be compared to the Arab Spring. I think we have a long way to get there, especially when it comes to el apoyo en la calle. We'll see what comes of protests today, but I would love for this to not be framed as a debate, and to be treated as you would treat the heroic act of people trying to free themselves from oppression, like we do in other parts of the world.
Listen, you went to the DNC last week. How was it?
I did.
You want to talk about it, or like not that I'm following the Pulso account, but I'm giving you an opportunity to address anything you need to address as a friend.
Yes. Me están acribillando en los comentarios. If you go to Pulso,
you're such a class act. Can I just say you're such a class act, because you are so transparent, and I just want to tell you that before you answer. Pulso has been around for 6 years. They've done amazing work, incredible community, and there's going to be times when you have to interact with the community. Do you want to have any? Because it could be like an on the record response if you want, as founder of Pulso, but it's your call.
Yeah, no, I would love to. Look, I wrote an op-ed around. I went to the DNC. Are we reclaiming patriotism? And I wrote about what I saw, a shift in narrative, and how the Democrats are talking about this moment and what's at stake. I acknowledge that even more patriotic would have been to have a Palestinian speaker on the stage and really nod to the uncommitted vote. And I said, this is a patriotism that I could get behind. And I expected there to be contentious responses from our audience. And that's exactly what we want. We want debate. We want to hear your opinions. This is a tense political moment, and I am here for it. I will be looking at the comments a little later today, a ver qué más está diciendo la gente, pero we have some strong opinions about
this.
About this very
You know
topic.
what I'm going to leave you with, Liz Rebecca, for someone who, and I'm kind of like the older brother sometimes, and you make fun of me because of, you call me a boomer, but I'm Gen
your
X.
white hair.
Yeah, I'm actually Gen X, but you're like, you're a boomer. But
about your graying hairline,
yeah.
yes.
It's all good. It's all good. But you know what I've said to you in the past, and I'll say it again on record. They can love you, they can hate you, but they're talking about you. And that's what Pulso and you have dove right in unapologetically, listening to the community. And you're never gonna please everyone, but as long as you're true to yourself, you're gonna be fine, right?
And that was the goal with that. We really welcome any point of view, and that was mine from being there in person. Así que ya veremos la pelea en los comentarios the next couple of days.
Oh, the popcorn! Liz Rebecca Alarcón, founder of Pulso. Thank you so much for being on the Latino Newsletter with me.
Thank you for having me.
There's Liz trying to lay it all out, give you some context. Follow her, follow Pulso to see, because they've been covering it. I mean, Liz has been very active talking about Venezuela and the Venezuelan community in South Florida. And she is an open book. Follow her, engage her, debate her. She welcomes the discussion. We should be elevating these stories more and more. We should be elevating these issues more and more. And that's what we're trying to do here. At the Latino Newsletter, which is produced and edited by me, Julio Ricardo Varela, and Joaquin Cotler, who, if given the chance, would want to be the backup center for the New York Knicks. Just saying. Just saying. Tibbs, if you're listening, Tibbs, you got a backup. And that mixing and sound design is also by Joaquin Cotler. He's multifaceted, Tibbs. He's multifaceted. And the music you heard is by Cast of Characters via Soundstripe. Listen, if you like what you heard, you can now donate to us at the latinonewsletter.org and click on the donate tab. And eventually, if you're on Spotify, we're going to try to begin to add some donation links as you listen. So that's sort of future plans. And if you like what you heard, share the podcast. Rate us wherever you get your podcasts. We're starting to get some comments on our Spotify feed. Thank you all. And like we said, we are on Spotify, but we're also on Apple Podcasts, Audible, iHeartRadio, etc. Wherever you find podcasts, we should be there. And we're at Lat Newsletter on Twitter, and everywhere else we're the Latino Newsletter on all other social networks, especially like TikTok. Come on, man. Over 500,000 views on TikTok. Let's go. And if you have a burning question about this show or anything else, or you want to get something off your chest, or you want to tell me that I'm doing a good job, or I should get demoted to, I don't know, Alaska, you can send me an email at julio@thelatinonewsletter.org. We're going to be back next week with another guest, with another show. Peace out, y'all.